Okay, so before I get started with what I'm going to ramble to you about, I would like to play a little game with y'all just to get to know you. So, what's going to happen in just a moment is a word is going to appear up on the screen, like the word tree, and that is obviously a word, so I need you to then, in that case, give me a resounding yes in response. And if a word pops up on the screen that is not a word you recognize, so as far as I know, tane is not a word in the English language, I need you to give me a resounding no. Does that all make sense? All right, so we're going to go through several words real quick, try to answer as fast as possible. Ready?
No. Yes. No. Yes. 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 No. Yes. 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 No.
Amazing. It went slightly better than I thought it was going to go. So you might have realized that those words slightly different the first and second half. And if we did this in a more controlled environment where I was able to measure everyone individually and see how long it took you to identify those words, we'd see that on average you would be just slightly ever so more quick to identify those first half of those words because they are consistent with the environment we're in right now. So I'm on a stage giving a talk, you're in your seats, we're all in a hall. So if we repeated that in, let's say, a pub, which being in front of you all right now is kind of where I'd rather be, then you would have been just slightly ever so quicker to identify those second half of the words, because then in that case they would match that environment. And those effects are driven by something called priming, which is just the idea that certain features of an environment or a situation or even an individual brings up certain information to be more accessible and more likely to guide our judgments and decisions. And back in the days, probably was advantageous and meant the difference between life and death, when shaving milliseconds off a decision, meant our survival. But these days, priming is likely facilitating some benign decisions, like, what we're going to eat in the morning for breakfast or how we're going to get to work or school. So the information that's brought up through priming is not just things like is a word or our preferences, but it also contains our behaviors, our expectations, and how we should act. You can think of these as a script, as if you're in a play. And a good example of that is in a room like this, where when things are happening on stage and people are talking overhead, that all of a sudden, if you were conversing with someone next to you, you might have quieted those conversations down and shifted your attention straight ahead. And that probably felt natural and reflexive. Didn't take much thought. It just felt like the right thing to do. And that is an example of priming. It's guiding these automatic behaviors, often happening outside of our conscious awareness, that helps us navigate our everyday world. However, the effects of priming aren't always as nice and polite as what I just described, and sometimes can be a bit more negative in terms of how we might interact with others. And that's what I'll be talking about for a little bit. So, to kind of give you a little backstory about the research I'll be talking about, when I was an undergrad, I was lucky enough to work in a lab where we got students in to see why they drank alcohol and tried to reduce their alcohol consumption. And if you've ever set foot on a university campus, which now that I've said that out loud, we technically are on one, you probably would have realized that I was very unsuccessful in that endeavor. Students are still drinking. But it did get me interested in alcohol. How does it affect your decision making? And then I started my PhD. And I worked with my supervisor, who was very passionate and dedicated to studying gender and racial inequalities in the academic world and beyond. And that was Dr. Pratina Kassad. And I thought, best of both worlds, combine these passions, get students in, give them alcohol, see if they use things like stereotypes more. And then I went to ethics with the idea, and they said it's probably not a good idea. Students are already drinking enough as is. We don't need to actively promote it. And I said, actually, fair enough. I see the error of my ways looking back. So then I was sort of at crossroads of what to do. I didn't know, that was my big idea. Until one fateful day. And this is a dramatic recreation. I was driving down a highway in the good old US of A, and all of a sudden saw a billboard on the side of the road, which didn't look like that one necessarily. For copyright issues, I had to make my own. That's definitely not AI generated. I can't, it's not going to produce anything that good, is it? And I saw this billboard that was depicting beer, and I started to think, well, I know about priming. How do these billboards just littered all over the side of our roads, which show all these things like alcohol, how is that influencing our behavior in ways that we might not be aware of? And I thought I hit the jackpot. It was my eureka moment. This is going to get me famous, until I Googled it. And then turns out I was, a couple decades behind the curve, and someone else did it. In fact, lots of people have done it. But I reached out to those people. They were very helpful. And like any, eager new scientist, I thought it'd be a good idea to try to replicate the effects of those primes, in this case, alcohol advertisements. And so what the research seems to suggest is that just viewing these things that we probably think are benign, such as an alcohol advertisement, or even those alcohol-related words I had on that last slide, is enough to promote, at least temporarily, the consequences of consuming alcohol. It makes people more aggressive, more likely to respond more intensely to ambiguous, threatening situations, and makes people more likely to discriminate. And so, across a couple experiments, I decided to test this myself. And brought students in, had them view some alcohol advertisements, and what do you know? They are more likely to use racial stereotypes afterwards when making snap judgments. And so what this suggests is that when we see these alcohol advertisements in our lives, which might pop up on the television that we're watching, or social media that we're scrolling through, or even potentially even being in an environment where this alcohol-related imagery is plastered everywhere, such as being even in or near a pub, we might be more likely to act on these stereotypes and discriminate against others. And importantly, those who identify with those stereotype groups might begin to anticipate or expect that discrimination when in those same environments. And that's something I investigated later on with my students. But instead of looking at alcohol advertisements, we decided to do something a bit more immersive, actually conduct our studies in the pub. But I thought through that process of reaching out to pubs, asking, do you want to be a part of our research? And figured it's probably not a good slogan to have your business associated with, a study that demonstrates the negative consequences of just being in those environments in terms of anticipating being discriminated against. So we did the next best thing. So we didn't go into a pub per se, but instead in this case, we're looking at anticipated sexism. We developed a pub in virtual reality. So using VR, we were able to design anything we wanted. We could change the number of men and women that were in the pub. We could change what was littered all over the walls. And in this case, this is a pub environment that was meant to replicate, to some extent, the masculine sports bar environment where things like sexism and sexual harassment are most likely to be anticipated. So we have sports jerseys lining the walls, we have pool tables, dartboards, and there's lots of ambient noise of, lots of dudes having chats. And we found that after women just spent just a few minutes in this environment, they started to experience those consequences of the direct experiences of sexism without any of that face-to-face discrimination, just merely being in that environment linked to those experiences. So they increased things like their physiological arousal, their heart rate, they exhibited poorer problem-solving ability, they took longer to solve relatively simple puzzles after taking off the VR headset. And so this suggests that just features of our physical world might be enough to trigger or prime these anticipated consequences of discrimination. And importantly, not all of this happens in the pub. There are things in our world that we don't necessarily see that might prime these expectations, but also things that we might hear. So in another study that was related to this one, we brought participants into our lab to interview for a job in our research team. Fortunately, no job was ever offered, so if you're one of the students who took part, I'm sorry, this is how to break the news to you. It was all a ruse. But we gave everyone the same job description, but before they interviewed, we gave them a little prime, an expectation of what it would be like to work in that organization, our research team. And in that case, the prime was just as simple. We are expecting the ideal candidate to be like a captain of a football team, managing all their players on the pitch. And just saying that little tiny thing beforehand made women's interview performance drop, in addition to increasing their physiological arousal, as in that pub environment. The same exact consequences. And on the other hand, men's performance shot up. They did great when you said, look, this environment's for you. And there was another condition where we tried to emphasize that the ideal candidate was more meant to be, in a communal role, caring for everyone like they're their family. And in that case, women's performance increased. And so all I'm trying to convince you all of is that there is so much of the world around us that shapes how we might treat others and how we might expect to be treated. Things that might seem relatively benign, like the advertisements littered on the side of the road, the environments we might frequent on a day-to-day basis, or even the language that we use to communicate expectations and information to others. And a lot of this is driven by these stereotypes. And so it starts to beg the question, well, where do stereotypes come from? And unfortunately, I don't know how much time I even have left, but even if I had all the time in the world, I probably couldn't even cover the amount of ways that stereotypes become embedded within our memories that drive all these effects I'm talking about right now. But one thing that I think that is worth talking about is the explosion of AI chatbots and large language models, which are trained on our human history, which is ingrained with these stereotypes. And if you interacted with early versions of these tools or saw them posted on social media, you might have seen some quite horrific things. So, for example, in the top left there, that is code being generated by an early version of ChatGPT, suggesting that only white men can be good scientists. And disturbing on the top right, that the brains of those who are white are more valuable than the brains of those from any other race. And obviously, posts like these that went viral led OpenAI to introduce safeguards to create more diverse and equitable AI-generated content. But even after that, I tinkered with it, and it didn't take much to see the biases emerge in other ways. So, for example, on the bottom there, trying to just estimate salaries for white and black applicants for a software developer role, ended up still seeing that black applicants needed additional years' experience and a higher level of education compared to the white applicants. And while newer iterations of these models keep emerging that are meant to be introducing more safeguards to present these inequalities, it does often seem like it's a game of whack-a-mole and very reactive in terms of trying to, appease their user base, rather than being proactive and, potentially not training these models on prejudiced content to begin with. And importantly, across several studies where we showed people these types of AI-generated prompts and prejudice responses, we found that both Black Americans and women who viewed this type of content were less likely to be trusting of these tools and less likely to intend to use them in the future, suggesting potential social disparities in the adoption of this emerging technology. And importantly, this is not the first time we've seen this. So, for example, men are more likely to use things like smart home devices, Alexa, Google Homes. And that's preceded by the fact that early versions of facial and voice recognition software seem to prefer white men. And so this kind of leads to the theme of today, which is life at the tipping point. And whether we like it or not, AI just seems to be growing in popularity and is becoming a part of our lives, whether we like it or not. But there's lots of issues with it that still need to be addressed. And while there's a lot of potential benefits to its inclusion to our lives, I think there are just as many risks. And I think one of the biggest risks is that it might undermine all the progress towards social equality that so many people have dedicated their lives to. And one of those people was, as mentioned earlier, my PhD supervisor, Dr. Bettina Cassad, who unfortunately passed away unexpectedly several years ago. And they obviously made a big impact on my life. They took a risk on me as a student and mentored me and gave me all the skills that I have today. But most importantly, ever since they passed, there's been a voice in my head asking the same question every day, which is, what would Bettina do? And she, unfortunately, didn't get to experience this growth of AI and all of its problematic generated content. And so, what would Bettina do? I wish she was here to tell me. It would make things a lot easier. But I think first is to make people aware of the fact that so much of the world around us shapes our behavior outside of our awareness, that we aren't always the most reliable narrators, and we're not making decisions in a way that reflects our true intentions, or at least are made in a logical way. And while it might be easy to tell people that we should be more reflective on our choices and more intentional and not rely on these automatic gut reactions driven by stereotypes to make judgments, unfortunately, our ability to monitor behavior is really bad, and we can't do it forever. So that's not always the easiest way. So, what can we do? Well, I think we're at a crossroads, and I think one solution to maintaining any progress towards social equality in the world is by trying to eliminate or change the stereotypes that are facilitated by these priming effects I talked about at the start of this talk. And there's lots of ways we can do that. There's lots of evidence to suggest how we can alter, modify, and remove stereotypes from memory. But with the advent of AI and its implementation in our everyday life, we have an opportunity to potentially leverage those tools to help us out by increasing the diversity, retraining these models on actual equitable content rather than the prejudiced human history that it is currently trained on. However, given that most of these organizations are ran for profit and their CEOs have aligned themselves with many prominent political figures who are advocating on dismantling of quality, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, probably not going to happen, so I'm not holding my breath for that anytime soon. So, again, I have to ask myself, well, what would Bettina do? And that is to be critical of these platforms and these tools and why they're very beneficial and have a lot of benefits, to be very aware of their consequences, that they are trained on the past and are really good at regurgitating that past, but they're not writing our future. So, anyway, thank you all.